It was 20 minutes past midnight when Robert Scott stepped out of the community center's side door, keys in hand, ready to go home to his daughter. That was when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the far end of the parking lot. He stopped walking. Under the pale light of a single flickering street lamp, a woman in a wheelchair was trying to move forward. One of her wheels had given out, twisted at an angle that made every push useless. Her hair was soaked flat against her face. Her hands were raw from the effort. And when she finally looked up and saw him standing there watching, she did not ask for help. She just looked at him, steady, careful, exhausted, the way someone looks when they have learned, over a very long time, that most people will keep walking. Robert Scott was not most people. He crossed the parking lot. He loaded her chair into his van. He drove her home, made her a cup of tea, and introduced her to a 10-year-old girl who immediately told her she could have the good pillow. He thought he was doing a small thing. He had no idea that the woman sitting quietly in his living room was the rightful heir to a $2 billion empire. He had no idea that the people who stole it from her already knew exactly where she was. And he had absolutely no idea that before this was over, he would lose his job, face a federal lawsuit, and nearly lose the only thing he had left worth fighting for. And here's what makes this story different from every other act of kindness you've ever heard. Robert didn't get rewarded for helping her. Not at first. First, he got punished. If this story is the kind that deserves to be heard, take a second right now to like and subscribe, because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. This is the story of Robert Scott, and it begins with one decision made in the rain. The cut above her temple had stopped bleeding, but just barely. Robert crouched in front of her, close enough to speak quietly. The rain had thickened in the last few minutes, coming down in cold, uneven sheets, and the lone street lamp above them buzzed and flickered like it was trying to make up its mind. He had found a first aid kit in his van, the same one he had carried since Joanne got hurt, and he had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that he would never be caught without one again. The woman, she had told him her name was Ellen, sat very still while he pressed a folded gauze pad against the cut. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She watched him with those steady, careful eyes, and Robert had the distinct feeling that she was not really seeing him. She was reading him, measuring something about him that had nothing to do with his face. "You don't have to come home with me," he said. "I can call someone. I'm not leaving you here." A pause. Rain against the asphalt. The distant sound of a car somewhere on the main road. "Okay," Ellen said. It was the smallest word he had ever heard carry that much weight. He loaded her wheelchair into the back of the van, the broken wheel clicking against the frame as he lifted it. The chair was old but well maintained, not neglected, just worn, the kind of worn that comes from daily use. He didn't ask about it. He didn't ask about anything. He just drove. The apartment on Caldwell Street was small and warm and smelled like the lavender dish soap Audrey had insisted on at the grocery store 2 weeks ago. Robert got Ellen settled on the couch, brought her a towel and a mug of tea, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, trying to figure out what a person was supposed to say next. Ellen looked around the room. Audrey's drawings covered the wall beside the television. Horses mostly, and rockets, and at least 2 pictures of what appeared to be a dog, though they had never owned one. A framed photo of Joanne sat on the shelf above the TV, smiling, mid-laugh, caught in the middle of a sentence she never got to finish. "Your wife?" Ellen asked. "Yeah," Robert said. He didn't offer anything else, but something in him loosened slightly, the way it always did when someone acknowledged Joanne without looking uncomfortable about it. Ellen nodded and wrapped both hands around the mug. They sat in silence, and it was not the awkward kind. Audrey found her at 7:15 the next morning. Robert heard it before he saw it. A pause in his daughter's usual thunder-footed march down the hallway, followed by a silence that lasted just long enough to make him set down his coffee and listen. Then, in a voice that was trying very hard to be polite and mostly succeeding, Audrey said, "Good morning. Are you a friend of my dad's?" Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway just in time to see Ellen lower her mug and look at his daughter with an expression he couldn't quite name. Something had shifted in her face, a softening around the edges that hadn't been there the night before. "I'm Ellen," she said. "I'm Audrey." A beat. "Do you like eggs? Dad makes them scrambled, but I think fried are better. He always says scrambled are faster, but I think that's just because he's tired." The corner of Ellen's mouth moved. "Fried," she said. "Definitely fried." Audrey turned to Robert with the expression of someone who had just won a long-running argument. Robert held up both hands in surrender and went to get the pan. Breakfast happened the way breakfasts do when a 10-year-old decides she is in charge. Loudly, warmly, and with very little room for anyone to be sad or quiet or careful. Audrey talked about her teacher. She talked about a book about a girl who trained horses. She asked Ellen if she'd ever seen a real horse up close. And when Ellen said yes, many times, Audrey pulled her chair 3 inches closer and said, "Tell me everything." Robert stood at the stove with his back to both of them and didn't say a word. He just listened, and somewhere underneath the ordinary noise of a Tuesday morning, something in his chest settled into a place it hadn't occupied in a very long time. He almost didn't check his phone. He had set it face down on the counter when he started cooking, the way he always did when Audrey was at the table. But when Audrey ran off to find her backpack, and Ellen went quiet in the living room, he flipped it over. A news alert had come through sometime in the last hour. 3 words stopped his thumb cold. Brock heiress still missing. He read the line beneath it. Family representatives express grave concern for the safety of Ellen S. Brock, 31, who disappeared from a private care facility 11 days ago. He turned slowly toward the living room. Ellen was watching him from the couch. She had not moved. She had not looked away. And in her eyes, those steady, careful eyes, was something he now recognized for exactly what it was. She had been waiting for this moment since the minute she got in his van. What came next would change everything Robert thought he understood about the woman sleeping on his couch, and about the people hunting for her. Robert set the phone face up on the counter so she could see the screen from across the room. She looked at the headline, then back at him. "I can explain," she said. "I know," Robert said quietly. "That's what I'm waiting for." The days before that conversation had been, in their own strange way, the calmest Robert had known in 2 years. Ellen had stayed, not intrusively, not as a guest who needed entertaining, but in the way certain people occupy a space, quietly, usefully, without drawing attention to themselves. She helped Audrey with a reading assignment the second night, sitting beside her at the kitchen table with the kind of patience that can't be performed, only felt. She noticed the stack of unopened letters on the counter, the ones from a law firm Robert had stopped opening 6 months ago, and asked once, carefully, if he wanted to talk about them. He did, it turned out. He hadn't expected to. They say I was let go for cause, he said, but the reason they gave wasn't true. I reported a safety violation, and 3 weeks later, I was out the door. Ellen was quiet for a moment. Did you sign anything when they terminated you? A separation agreement. My cousin said just sign it and move on. Do you still have a copy? Robert looked at her. Why? Separation agreements can be challenged if the termination was retaliatory, she said. Depends on the wording. She paused. It might be worth looking at again. Robert stared at her for a moment longer than was polite. Ellen picked up her mug and said nothing else. That was the thing about her. She dropped observations like breadcrumbs and then went completely silent, as if she hadn't said anything unusual at all. Robert started to notice it the way you notice a puzzle piece that almost fits. The precise language, the way she listened with her whole body, the way her eyes sharpened when Audrey mentioned something about a neighbor's contract dispute she'd overheard at school. Like a person fluent in a language pretending not to be. He had told himself he wasn't asking questions because she deserved the space. That was partly true. The other part was that asking questions would end something he hadn't realized he needed until it arrived. Now she sat across from him at the kitchen table, and the phone between them made the room feel smaller than it was. My name is Ellen Brock, she said. My father was Carlton Brock. He built a real estate company from nothing over 30 years. When he died, he left it to me. She said this without pride or grief, just fact. He also left it with a man named Elias Ferguson as executor of the estate. Elias had been the family attorney for 15 years. My father trusted him completely. And you? Robert asked. I had reasons not to. Her jaw tightened briefly. Elias worked with a man named Nicholas Turman, the company's CFO. Nicholas was my fiancé until I ended it, about a year before my father died. When my father passed, the two of them moved fast. They filed a competency petition with the court, claiming my neurological condition left me unable to manage my own affairs. Your condition, Robert said carefully. I have a movement disorder. It affects my coordination and, when I'm stressed, my speech. It is real. It is manageable. It does not affect my mind. Her voice was even, but something behind it had gone very flat. Elias knew exactly how to frame it. He had documentation from doctors I'd never met. He had testimony from people I'd never spoken to. Within 6 weeks, I was a ward of the court and he was controlling the estate. She paused. They put me in a private facility. They called it a care home. It had locks on the outside of the doors. The kitchen was very quiet. Ellen reached down to the side panel of her wheelchair, a narrow section along the inner frame that Robert had taken for structural reinforcement, and pressed 2 points simultaneously. A small rectangular compartment clicked open. Inside, folded into quarters and sealed in a thin plastic sleeve, was a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the table between them. My father wrote that 3 weeks before he died. He knew what Elias was planning. He named them both. He wrote down dates, account numbers, and exactly what he believed they intended to do. She looked at the letter, then at Robert. That letter is the only thing I took when I left. I've been carrying it for 11 days. Robert looked at the paper for a long time without touching it. Then he looked at his daughter's bedroom door, half open, the sound of Audrey's music just barely audible through the gap. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but it cost him something. Ellen, he stopped, started again. I have a 10-year-old girl sleeping 15 feet from where we're sitting, and everything you just told me means that the people looking for you are not going to stop at my front door. He pressed his hands flat against the table. I can't protect you from that. I'm a security guard. I fix broken things in a parking lot. Ellen looked at him. She did not argue. She did not plead. She folded the letter back into its sleeve, placed it into the compartment, and pressed it closed with a soft, final click. "I'll leave in the morning," she said. "Okay," Robert said. He meant it. He was sure of that. He just couldn't explain why, when he lay in bed an hour later staring at the ceiling, it felt like the most wrong word he had ever spoken. And here's the thing about letting someone go to keep yourself safe. Sometimes the danger follows you anyway. Ellen was gone before Robert woke up. He knew before he even reached the living room. The apartment had a different quality to its silence, emptier, like a room after furniture has been moved, and you can suddenly see the marks on the wall where it used to be. The blanket on the couch was folded. The mug she had used the night before was washed and placed upside down on the drying rack. And on the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker, was a pale blue scarf she had draped over the back of a chair 3 days ago and never retrieved. Robert stood looking at it for a long moment. Then he made Audrey's lunch, drove her to school, and went to work. He told himself it was the right thing. He told himself that 11 times before noon. The woman from Child Protective Services arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after Ellen left. She was professional and soft-spoken, the kind of person who smiled at just the right intervals, and she held a clipboard with a form already partially filled out. She said she was following up on an anonymous concern submitted regarding the welfare of a child in the home. She said it was routine. She said Robert had nothing to worry about as long as everything was in order. Robert stood in the doorway of his own apartment and felt the floor shift beneath him. He answered every question. He showed her Audrey's room, the food in the refrigerator, the school attendance records he kept in a folder in the kitchen drawer because Joanne had always kept them there and he had never stopped. The woman wrote things down, thanked him, and said someone would follow up within 2 weeks. Robert closed the door and stood with his back against it. He knew what this was. He didn't have a name for the man behind it yet, but he understood the shape of it. The way it arrived, dressed as concern, the way it smiled, the way it left him with nothing to argue against and no one to confront. Whoever was looking for Ellen had found him instead, and they had found the most precise possible way to make him afraid. It worked. He was afraid in the particular way that only a single parent can be. Not for himself, but for the small person who had no say in any of this. The termination letter came from the community center's management company the following Monday. Brief, formal. The word restructuring used 4 times without once explaining what had been restructured. His position was eliminated, effective immediately. Final check within 5 business days. He called the number listed, was placed on hold for 40 minutes, and was disconnected. He sat at the kitchen table and did the math in his head. Rent due in 18 days. Audrey's school supplies. The van's oil change he had already pushed back twice. Outside the window, his neighbors from the 3rd floor, the Petersons, passed on the sidewalk below. Mrs. Peterson looked up, saw him through the glass, and looked away quickly. She had always waved before. Robert understood. ACPS visit was the kind of thing people noticed, the kind of thing that made them careful. He didn't blame her, he just felt it. The particular loneliness of watching someone decide you are a risk they don't want to take. He pulled out the civil lawsuit summons that had arrived the day before. Wrongful interference with a protected ward of the court. His name in clean legal type. Elias Ferguson's firm listed at the top. Robert didn't know the name yet, but he would. He was still sitting there when he heard Audrey come in from school. She dropped her bag by the door, went to the kitchen for a snack, and then she stopped. Robert watched her reach out and pick up the pale blue scarf from the counter, the one Ellen had left behind. Audrey held it in both hands, rubbing the edge between her fingers the way she used to rub the hem of Joanne's cardigan when she was small and needed something to hold. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked at her father, and her expression was so calm and so serious that it made his chest ache. "Dad," she said, "you always tell me that brave people don't leave until it's fixed." She held the scarf a little tighter. "So why did you make Miss Ellen go?" Robert opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Audrey looked at him one more moment, then carried the scarf to her room and quietly closed the door. Robert sat very still. The civil summons was still face down on the counter. The coffee in his mug had gone cold an hour ago. He stood up. He picked up his keys. He walked out the door. He didn't know yet if he was too late. He found her on the third try. The first shelter was a converted gymnasium on the east side of the city. The man at the front desk shook his head before Robert finished the description. The second was a church annex on Brevard Street, where a woman in a yellow vest said gently that she couldn't share information about residents. Robert thanked her, got back in the van, and kept driving. The third place was a transitional housing facility off Beatty's Ford Road. Low brick building, a wheelchair ramp at the front entrance, a hand-painted sign by the door that read, "All are welcome here." Robert pulled into the lot and was halfway to the entrance when he stopped. Two vehicles were parked along the curb he hadn't noticed from the road. A black sedan with no markings, a county health services van, rear doors standing open. 3 people in lanyards gathered near the building's side exit, talking in low voices. One held a clipboard, another was on a phone, and between them, very still, very upright in her wheelchair, was Ellen. Robert started moving before he'd made any decision to move. He crossed the lot in long strides, calling her name. Ellen turned at the sound of his voice, and for 1 second, just one, something broke open in her expression. Relief. And then immediately something worse than relief. Something that looked like apology. "Sir?" One of the lanyard people stepped forward, a woman with a measured tone and a badge that read, "Court Services." "This is an authorized wellness intervention under a standing guardianship order. I need you to step back." "She's not," Robert started. "Sir?" Her voice didn't change. "If you interfere with this process, you will be in violation of a court order. Step back now." Ellen was looking at him, not crying, not asking for anything. Looking at him the way she had looked at him in the parking lot on the very first night, reading him, measuring him, deciding in a very short amount of time whether to trust what she saw. Then she reached into the compartment along the wheelchair's inner frame. The same compartment. She pressed it open, took out the folded letter in its plastic sleeve, and held it toward him. "Take it," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hand was trembling. The court officer moved to intervene. Robert stepped forward and took the letter from Ellen's hand in the same motion, fast enough that there was nothing to object to, nothing that crossed any visible line. He closed his fingers around it. Ellen looked at him one last time. "His name is Elias Ferguson. The firm is Ferguson and Associates. Everything you need is in that letter." Then the court officer stepped between them, and the space where Ellen had been was just a wheelchair ramp and a rectangle of gray October sky. Robert stood in the parking lot and watched the van pull away. He drove home slowly, not because he was calm, because his hands were doing something on the steering wheel he didn't entirely trust. A fine, persistent tremor that hadn't been there an hour ago. He gripped tighter and focused on the road. A man walking a dog, 2 kids on bikes, a woman carrying groceries in both arms. The city moving on as if nothing had just happened in a parking lot off Beatty's Ford Road. He picked Audrey up from his neighbor, Mrs. Joanne Scott's apartment, where she had been since school. Joanne, his mother-in-law, white-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who had taught 30 years of middle school English and never once lost command of a room, looked at Robert's face in the doorway and said nothing. She just squeezed his arm once, hard, and let him take Audrey home. Audrey was quiet on the walk upstairs. She held the pale blue scarf folded over her arm like she was carrying something important. Robert made dinner, washed the dishes, helped Audrey with her homework, sat on the edge of her bed while she fell asleep, and listened to her breathing slow and even out, the most reliable sound in his world. Then he went to the kitchen table and sat down alone. Carlton Brock's handwriting was precise and slanted slightly to the right. The pen pressed hard enough that the words raised the back of the page like braille. Robert read the letter twice, slowly. Names, dates, account numbers. A father writing in plain language what he believed was being planned for his daughter. Signed and dated 3 weeks before his death. He set the letter down. Termination notice on the counter, civil summons beside it, CPS follow-up still pending, a neighbor who had stopped waving. He had no job, a lawsuit with his name on it, a 10-year-old girl asleep down the hall, and a single sheet of paper written by a dead man that could either change everything or mean absolutely nothing, depending on whether there was a single person left in the world willing to look at it. He pressed both palms flat against the table and breathed. Outside, a dog barked once, then stopped. Robert picked up the letter, turned it over in his hands. He thought about Joanne, his wife, not his mother-in-law, and what she used to say at the end of the days that had ground them both down to almost nothing. You don't have to see the whole road, you just have to see the next step. He reached for his phone, opened the browser, typed 4 words. Disability rights attorney, Charlotte. He started reading. James P. Wright called back in 40 minutes. His voice was younger than Robert expected. Quicker, with the careful energy of someone who had spent years being told to slow down and had decided not to. He asked 2 questions: how Robert knew Ellen Brock, and whether the letter in his possession was an original document or a copy. When Robert answered both, there was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to mean something. I've been building a case against Ferguson's guardianship practice for 22 months, James said. I have financial records showing irregular estate transfers, 3 former clients who'll speak on record, and a forensic accountant who's already reviewed Brock Company filings from the last 2 years. Another pause. What I don't have is a primary witness to Ellen Brock's competency. Someone who spent real time with her. Someone a judge will believe. Robert looked across the room at Mrs. Joanne Scott, who had come upstairs an hour ago and was now sitting at his kitchen table with her reading glasses on, going through the civil summons with the focused expression of a woman who had once failed exactly 0 students and did not intend to start now. I might have too, Robert said. The emergency injunction hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 9 days after Ellen was taken. James filed on a Tuesday. He filed with Carlton Brock's letter as the primary exhibit, cross-referenced against the financial records his own investigators had spent months compiling. He filed with a sworn affidavit from Joanne Scott, who described in precise and unhurried language what she had observed during the weeks Ellen lived in the building. Her clarity, her patience with Audrey, the careful legal analysis she had offered Robert over a kitchen table without once being asked. Joanne wrote 4 drafts of that affidavit at Robert's kitchen table, discarding each one until the language was exactly right. She said it reminded her of grading essays. She said some things were too important to submit until they were done properly. James also filed with Robert's own testimony. What Ellen had told him about the facility, the locked doors, the doctors she had never met, the petition built on evidence manufactured by the very man appointed to protect her. Elias Ferguson's legal team filed a counter-motion within hours. Precise. Confident. The guardianship order cited 3 times on the first page alone. Robert read it that night and felt the familiar cold settle in his chest, the system reminding him of exactly how small he was inside it. He folded the counter motion in half and set it under the civil summons on the counter. Then he checked on Audrey, who was asleep with the pale blue scarf tucked beside her pillow, like a bookmark in a story she was waiting to finish. Robert wasn't in the courtroom when the injunction was granted. James had told him it would be better that way. Cleaner, no complications. Robert spent that Thursday morning sitting in the van outside the building where he used to work. Not because he had any reason to be there, but because it was the only place he could think of where he could be still without feeling like the walls were closing in. His phone rang at 11:47. "It's done," James said. "The injunction was granted. The guardianship order is suspended pending full review. Ellen walks out this afternoon." Robert pressed the phone against his forehead and breathed. "The counterfiling by Ferguson's team actually helped us," James continued, and Robert could hear something in his voice that sounded almost like satisfaction. "They overcorrected. Tried to introduce a new psychiatric evaluation conducted 3 days ago. The judge wanted to know why a woman who was supposedly incompetent had managed 11 days of independent survival across 2 counties without assistance. Ferguson's attorney didn't have a good answer for that." Robert stared through the windshield at the community center's front entrance. At the wheelchair ramp he had fixed himself 18 months ago when the facilities manager said it wasn't in the budget. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now it gets loud," James said. It did. The case broke across local news first, then climbed. Elias Ferguson's name appeared in headlines before the week was out. A financial journalist who had been watching Brock Company filings for months reported Nicholas Turman's connection to the estate transfers within days. Within 3 weeks, the state bar opened a formal disciplinary investigation into Ferguson. Within 6, Nicholas Turman was removed from the Brock board and placed under federal investigation for fiduciary fraud. The competency ruling was overturned entirely. Ellen was restored as executor of her father's estate. Robert's civil summons was quietly withdrawn. No explanation, no apology, just gone. The way threats always disappear when the power behind them collapses. The community center called and offered his job back. He said he'd think about it. He was still thinking. 6 months passed. He was in the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, Audrey at the table doing homework, a pot of pasta sauce on the stove that he had, under significant and repeated instruction from a woman who was no longer present, finally learned to make correctly. The recipe was written on a notepad in handwriting that wasn't his, propped against the backsplash where he could read it. The knock at the door was quiet. 3 even beats. Robert turned off the burner. He crossed the living room. He opened the door. Ellen stood in the hallway. Same wheelchair, repaired now, both wheels true and straight. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, a deep burgundy that suited her. She looked rested. She looked like herself, fully and without apology. In her lap, she held a jar of pasta sauce, a different brand than the one on his stove, and a deck of cards with the words "Go Fish" printed on the box in bright yellow letters. She held them up slightly. "Audrey said I was using the wrong brand," she said. "She was very specific about it in the letter she sent me." A pause. "She also said she wanted a rematch." Robert looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open wide. From the kitchen, Audrey's chair scraped back from the table. There was a beat of silence, the particular silence of a 10-year-old registering something she had been hoping for long enough that the reality of it takes a second to arrive. And then the sound of socked feet moving fast across hardwood. Ellen had just enough time to set the jar and the cards on the hallway table before Audrey reached her. She held on the way children hold on when they have learned, earlier than they should have, that people can disappear. Tight, both arms, for a long time. Ellen closed her eyes. Robert leaned against the door frame and watched the two of them and did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say. The sauce was on the stove, the cards were on the table, the door was open. Some things, once broken, don't just heal. They grow back stronger in the place where the break was, harder, more certain, more permanent than anything that had existed there before. He pushed off the doorframe and went to finish dinner.